Sometimes the greatest love story begins with two people who believe they have no choice. The rain had been falling over a quiet neighborhood outside Denver for nearly an hour when Daniel Carter looked up from the small wooden table where he and his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, were finishing homemade tomato soup. Their modest house was warm despite its age, filled with the comforting scent of fresh bread and the gentle sound of rain tapping against the windows. Daniel, a white American single father in his late 30s, had learned long ago that peace was not something money could buy. It was built one quiet evening at a time, one honest conversation at a time, and one promise kept after another. Lily looked toward the front window as headlights stopped outside the house. "Daddy," she whispered, "someone is here." Daniel smiled softly and stood without hurry. Visitors rarely arrived after dark, especially during heavy rain, but something inside him remained strangely calm. He opened the front door and found a woman standing beneath a black umbrella, her elegant navy business coat damp from the weather, her blonde hair slightly touched by the rain, and her blue eyes carrying a mixture of confidence and uncertainty. Emily Brooks was one of the youngest female chief executive officers in the country, a white American business leader whose name frequently appeared on financial news broadcasts, yet standing there she looked nothing like the powerful executive people admired from a distance. She looked exhausted. She slowly lowered the umbrella and met Daniel's eyes with surprising honesty. "My family sent me here," she said quietly. "They told me that beginning tonight, I am supposed to become your wife." The words lingered between them while rain continued falling around the porch. Most people would have laughed, questioned her sanity, or demanded an explanation. Daniel did none of those things. He studied her face for only a brief moment, not searching for deception but searching for fear. What he found was someone carrying an invisible burden much heavier than the expensive suitcase resting beside her feet. His expression never changed. "I believe you," he answered with complete sincerity. Emily blinked in surprise. She had prepared herself for disbelief, anger, and endless questions, but not acceptance. "You believe me?" she asked almost in disbelief. Daniel nodded gently. "People only travel through a storm like this when something important is waiting at the other end." Emily looked down, unable to hide the emotion building behind her composed executive mask. For months she had fought against a decision made years before she was old enough to understand it. A promise between two families had quietly followed her into adulthood, and every attempt to escape it had only led her back to the address now standing before her. Inside the house, Lily peeked around the doorway with innocent curiosity. "Daddy," she asked softly, "is our guest staying for dinner?" Daniel smiled. "Only if she would like to." Emily looked at the warm light spilling from the doorway, then back toward the luxury sedan waiting at the curb, the symbol of the life she had always known. One path led back to boardrooms, investors, and endless expectations. The other led into a small home where a father and daughter shared homemade soup without pretending to be anything except themselves. For the first time in many years, Emily realized that the most frightening step in her life was not walking into an unfamiliar house. It was allowing herself to believe she might finally be walking toward the place where she truly belonged. Emily Brooks stepped across the doorway with quiet hesitation, carefully setting her suitcase just inside the entrance as Daniel Carter closed the door behind her. The sound of the rain immediately softened, replaced by the warmth of a modest home that carried the comforting scent of fresh bread, tomato soup, and old pine wood. It was not the kind of house featured in luxury magazines or executive architecture journals. The furniture was simple, the walls displayed family photographs instead of expensive artwork, and every corner reflected years of careful maintenance rather than wealth. Emily slowly looked around, trying to reconcile the peaceful scene before her with everything she had expected. She had prepared herself to meet a desperate man eager to benefit from an arranged marriage. Instead, she found a quiet father whose first concern had been whether she needed shelter from the storm. Lily smiled warmly from the dining table. "You can sit next to me," she said with the natural kindness only a child could offer. Emily hesitated for a moment before accepting the invitation. She removed her damp coat and folded it neatly across the back of the chair. Daniel quietly placed another bowl of soup on the table without ceremony, as though welcoming unexpected guests during heavy rain was simply part of his routine. "Thank you," Emily said softly. "You are welcome," Daniel replied with a gentle smile. "Dinner always tastes better when nobody eats alone." The simplicity of the statement lingered in Emily's thoughts. In boardrooms she negotiated contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, yet she could not remember the last time someone had offered her a meal without expecting something in return. As they ate, Lily happily described her school art project, her favorite library books, and the vegetables she had helped grow in the small backyard garden. Daniel listened carefully to every sentence, occasionally asking gentle questions that made his daughter smile even wider. Emily found herself quietly observing rather than participating. The conversation contained no mention of business, inheritance, or the unusual circumstances that had brought her there. It revolved entirely around family, encouragement, and ordinary moments that somehow felt extraordinary. After dinner Daniel cleared the dishes while Lily insisted on drying them with a small towel almost as large as her arms. Emily instinctively stood to help. "Please," Daniel said politely, "you have traveled a long way today. You are our guest." Emily looked at him with genuine confusion. "You are not curious?" she finally asked. "About why my family arranged this? About my company? About what I own?" Daniel gently rinsed another plate before answering. "If those answers matter, you will tell me when you are ready. Trust offered too early is fragile. Trust earned naturally lasts much longer." Emily became silent. She had spent years surrounded by people who introduced themselves through titles, achievements, and financial success. Daniel introduced himself through patience. Later that evening Lily proudly carried a folded blanket into the small guest room. "I helped Daddy make the bed," she said with a bright smile. "I hope you like it here." Emily looked around the simple room with its handmade quilt, bookshelf filled with classic novels, and small lamp casting warm golden light across the walls. There was nothing expensive inside the room, yet everything felt intentionally prepared. She quietly sat on the edge of the bed after Lily closed the door. Outside, the rain continued falling against the windows, but for the first time in many months the sound no longer reminded her of pressure, deadlines, or expectations. It sounded peaceful. She realized that in only a single evening, the quiet single father had done something no executive, consultant, or advisor had ever accomplished. Without asking a single question about her wealth or status, he had made her feel like a person instead of a position, and that unexpected feeling unsettled her far more deeply than the arranged marriage itself. Morning sunlight filtered gently through the kitchen window as Daniel Carter quietly prepared breakfast before Lily woke for school. The small house carried its familiar rhythm, one shaped not by alarms or business meetings but by steady routines that had been built through years of love and responsibility. Emily Brooks stepped into the kitchen wearing a simple sweater she had borrowed from the guest room closet after discovering her suitcase had been left unopened the previous evening. She paused at the doorway, watching Daniel carefully slice fresh fruit while pancakes cooked on the stove. There was no rush in his movements, no unnecessary conversation, only calm attention to ordinary moments that somehow felt unusually meaningful. "Good morning," Daniel said warmly without turning around. "Coffee is on the counter if you would like some." Emily accepted the mug with a quiet thank you and waited, almost expecting him to begin asking questions about her company, her family fortune, or the unusual arrangement that had brought her into his home. Instead, Daniel simply placed another plate on the table before calling upstairs for Lily. A few moments later the little girl hurried down the staircase with cheerful excitement, greeting both adults with an enthusiastic smile before eagerly sitting down for breakfast. Conversation centered entirely around school assignments, the weather forecast, and whether the tomatoes in the backyard garden would finally be ready by the weekend. Emily listened carefully, realizing once again that Daniel never attempted to impress anyone. He spoke gently, encouraged Lily to finish her breakfast, and reminded her to thank the crossing guard after school as he did every morning. After they walked Lily to the neighborhood elementary school together, Daniel and Emily returned home through quiet residential streets lined with large maple trees. The morning air felt cool and peaceful. Emily finally decided to ask the question that had remained in her thoughts since arriving. "You know who I am," she said softly. "You have probably seen interviews, magazine covers, financial reports. Does none of that interest you?" Daniel smiled thoughtfully before answering. "It tells me what you do. It does not tell me who you are." Emily looked at him with genuine curiosity. "Most people only see the title." Daniel nodded. "Titles are useful in offices. Character matters at home." His answer lingered in the silence between them. Determined to understand him better, Emily decided to test what she believed was impossible. Later that afternoon, she intentionally mentioned a luxury vacation home she owned along the California coast, expecting even a brief expression of surprise. Daniel simply replied that he hoped the view of the ocean was beautiful. She spoke about private jets, exclusive events, and international business meetings. Daniel listened politely but asked no follow-up questions. Finally, she looked directly at him and asked, "Are you honestly not curious about how much my company is worth?" Daniel closed the book he had been reading on the porch and answered with the same calm sincerity she had heard on the first night. "Money can explain comfort. It cannot explain kindness. If we are going to live under the same roof, I would rather know what makes you smile than what appears on your financial statements." Emily fell completely silent. Throughout her career, she had learned how to negotiate billion-dollar contracts, identify hidden business risks, and recognize manipulation within seconds. Yet she could not understand the quiet man sitting beside her. Every assumption she had carried into his home was slowly falling apart, replaced by a growing realization that the greatest mystery before her was not why their families had arranged this marriage, but how someone with so little interest in wealth could possess a richness of character that no amount of success had ever taught her to recognize. The following Saturday arrived with clear blue skies, and the peaceful rhythm of Daniel Carter's home continued as naturally as it had every day before Emily Brooks appeared on his doorstep. After breakfast, Lily hurried outside carrying a small watering can almost half her size, determined to help her father care for the backyard vegetable garden. Daniel smiled as he followed her into the morning sunshine, rolling up the sleeves of his flannel shirt before kneeling beside the raised garden beds. Emily watched quietly from the back porch, holding a warm mug of coffee between both hands. She had attended executive meetings in New York, London, and San Francisco, but she had never seen two people find so much happiness while watering tomato plants and pulling weeds. Lily laughed as she accidentally splashed water onto her own shoes, and Daniel chuckled softly before showing her how to pour more carefully around the roots. There was no impatience in his voice, only encouragement. "Plants grow better when we are patient," he told her. "People usually do too." Emily found herself smiling without realizing it. Later that morning, Daniel suggested they visit the local farmers market before picking up a few library books for Lily. The small downtown streets were filled with neighbors greeting one another by name. Daniel stopped several times to introduce Emily, never mentioning that she was the chief executive officer of a nationally recognized company. Instead, he simply said, "This is our guest," allowing her to be known first as a person rather than a title. The simplicity of that introduction stayed with her throughout the morning. At the library, Lily eagerly searched the children's section while Daniel recommended classic novels to the librarian, who thanked him for donating books every year through a quiet community program that few people seemed to know about. Emily looked at him with surprise. "You never mentioned you volunteered here," she said. Daniel shrugged gently. "Some things are more meaningful when they are not announced." His answer settled into her thoughts more deeply than she expected. On the drive home, Lily suddenly asked from the back seat, "Miss Emily, do you know how to bake cookies?" Emily laughed softly. "I have never really tried." Lily smiled brightly. "Daddy can teach both of us." Daniel glanced at Emily with an amused expression before nodding. "I think that sounds like a good Saturday project." Back at the house, Flower covered the kitchen counter while Lily measured chocolate chips with absolute seriousness. Emily accidentally spilled sugar across the table, and for a brief moment she looked embarrassed. Daniel simply handed her a clean towel with a warm smile. The best kitchens always get a little messy, he said. The afternoon filled with laughter, warm cookies, and ordinary conversations that required no strategy, negotiation, or performance. As the smell of fresh baking drifted through the house, Emily realized something that unsettled her in the gentlest possible way. She had spent years believing success meant leading thousands of employees, making impossible decisions, and carrying constant responsibility. Yet this small home, with its laughter, simple routines, and quiet kindness, possessed a kind of wealth no financial statement could ever record. That evening Lily carried a plate of warm cookies onto the porch and happily sat between Daniel and Emily as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the distant mountains. Without thinking, Lily reached for Emily's hand while leaning against Daniel's shoulder. Neither adult moved away. In that simple, unplanned moment, Emily felt something she had not expected to experience so quickly. The little girl had accepted her without conditions, and the quiet father beside her had never once asked her to become anyone other than herself. For the first time since arriving, Emily no longer felt like a visitor staying in a stranger's house. She began to wonder whether the smallest member of the family had quietly seen the truth long before either adult was willing to admit it. The quiet rhythm of life inside Daniel Carter's home continued through the following week, but Emily Brooks sensed that beneath the peaceful routines there were unanswered questions waiting patiently for the right moment to emerge. Every morning Daniel walked Lily to school before returning home to work remotely as a freelance architectural designer, spending afternoons maintaining the small house, helping neighbors with simple repairs, and reading with Lily before bedtime. Nothing about his life appeared extraordinary, yet every ordinary action carried remarkable consistency. Emily had built her career by recognizing patterns, and the pattern she found in Daniel was unlike anything she had ever encountered. He never exaggerated his accomplishments, never complained about sacrifice, and never attempted to gain sympathy. The more she observed him, the more impossible it became to reconcile his quiet life with the mysterious promise that had brought her there. One afternoon while Daniel drove Lily to a piano lesson, Emily remained at the house to prepare dinner. As she searched a hallway cabinet for extra plates, she noticed an old wooden box resting on the highest shelf. It was not hidden, only forgotten. She carefully lowered it onto the kitchen table and opened the lid, expecting family photographs or childhood keepsakes. Instead she found neatly organized letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon, along with several newspaper clippings and a worn leather journal. She hesitated before unfolding the first letter, recognizing her late father's handwriting almost immediately. Her heart began to race as she slowly read each line. Years before his company became one of the largest corporations in the country, her father had written about a devastating financial crisis that nearly destroyed everything he had built. He described losing investors, facing impossible debt, and preparing to tell hundreds of employees that the business would close forever. Then one sentence stopped Emily completely. A young architect named Daniel Carter restored more than a building, her father had written. Without expecting recognition, he gave me back the courage to rebuild both my company and my integrity. Emily continued reading with growing disbelief. The letters revealed that Daniel had quietly redesigned several failing company facilities without charging professional fees after learning employees might lose their jobs. He had even refused generous financial rewards, asking only that the workers be protected if the company recovered. Her father had repeatedly tried to repay the kindness, but Daniel had always declined. Finally, Emily opened the leather journal and found a handwritten entry from nearly 20 years earlier. It described a promise between two fathers. If life ever separated their families through success, hardship, or distance, they would one day reunite them through trust rather than obligation. Emily closed the journal slowly, overwhelmed by the realization that the arrangement she had resisted was never intended as a business transaction or social contract. It had been the fulfillment of gratitude preserved across decades. Just then the front door opened and Lily happily ran inside carrying sheet music while Daniel followed with grocery bags balanced comfortably in both arms. Emily looked toward him, her eyes filled with emotions she had not expected to feel. Daniel noticed the open box but showed no alarm. He simply placed the groceries on the counter and smiled gently. I always wondered when you would discover those letters, he said quietly. Emily struggled to speak. Why did you never tell me? Daniel answered with the same calm sincerity that had defined every conversation since her arrival. Because gratitude loses its meaning the moment it becomes a tool for influence. Your father helped many people after his company recovered. That was always enough for me. Emily lowered her eyes, realizing that everything she had believed about the arranged marriage had been incomplete. She had arrived believing she was fulfilling an obligation imposed by the past, but the truth was far more beautiful. She was standing inside a home built by quiet promises, enduring kindness, and a man whose greatest acts of generosity had remained invisible because he had never needed anyone to applaud them. The discovery of the letters changed something inside Emily Brooks that could not be measured by business logic or explained through careful analysis. She no longer looked at Daniel Carter as the quiet single father living in a modest house outside Denver. She now saw the man who had quietly protected hundreds of families decades earlier without ever expecting recognition. Yet Daniel himself continued living exactly as he always had. The following Monday morning he packed Lily's school lunch, tied her backpack, reminded her to be kind to a classmate who had recently moved into town, and drove her to school with the same calm smile that greeted every new day. Emily watched him from the front porch, realizing that genuine character never changed simply because someone finally discovered the truth. Later that afternoon Emily received an unexpected phone call from the chairman of her company's board of directors. An emergency executive meeting had been scheduled in Denver after rumors about her prolonged absence began spreading through the business community. Respectfully, Daniel offered to drive her downtown while Lily spent the afternoon at a neighbor's house after school. During the drive neither of them spoke much. The peaceful silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt familiar. When they arrived at the company headquarters, the contrast between Daniel's simple pickup truck and the polished glass tower drew immediate attention. Several executives standing near the entrance exchanged curious glances before recognizing their chief executive officer stepping out beside an ordinary-looking man wearing jeans and a neatly pressed flannel shirt. Emily noticed the expressions immediately but continued walking without hesitation. Inside the executive conference room, senior board members and major investors had already gathered around the long polished table. Before the meeting formally began, Victor Langford, the ambitious chief operating officer who had quietly hoped to replace Emily as chief executive officer, smiled politely before speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. I suppose this is the gentleman everyone has been talking about, he said while looking directly at Daniel. Interesting choice. I never imagined the future husband of our chief executive officer would appear so uncomplicated. A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the room, though no one openly laughed. Daniel simply nodded courteously and remained silent. Victor continued with carefully disguised confidence. Forgive my curiosity, but I assume you have experience managing something larger than a small family home. Life beside a corporate leader can become rather demanding. Emily immediately recognized the hidden insult and prepared to respond, but Daniel gently touched her arm before calmly answering himself. You are correct, he said with a warm, composed smile. Responsibility can become demanding. That is why it should never be measured by the size of a paycheck. Raising a child to become kind has been the most important leadership position I have ever accepted. Silence settled across the room. Daniel's voice had remained soft, respectful, and completely free of resentment, yet every word carried quiet conviction. Victor attempted to recover his confidence. Business is not exactly the same as parenting. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. No, it is not. But both require keeping promises after applause has disappeared. The room grew even quieter. Emily watched several board members lower their eyes as the meaning of Daniel's words settled over the table. There had been no argument, no public embarrassment, and no attempt to prove superiority. Daniel simply answered with dignity before politely excusing himself, explaining that Lily would soon finish school and he had promised to be waiting outside the front gate. As he quietly walked out of the conference room, Emily realized that Victor had tried to diminish the man she cared about using appearances, but without raising his voice or defending his pride, Daniel had reminded an entire room of accomplished executives that true leadership was never defined by status, wealth, or titles. It was revealed by the promises a person continued to keep when nobody was watching. Emily Brooks remained seated in the executive conference room long after Daniel Carter quietly left to pick up Lily from school. Around the polished table, the conversation gradually returned to quarterly reports, expansion strategies, and shareholder expectations, yet the atmosphere had unmistakably changed. The board members who had witnessed Daniel's calm response found themselves speaking with unusual restraint, as though a simple reminder about integrity had quietly rearranged the priorities of the room. Emily listened, but her attention was elsewhere. She realized that the man who had never held a corporate title had just demonstrated more authentic leadership in 2 minutes than many executives managed in an entire career. When the meeting finally ended, she returned to her office overlooking the Denver skyline. Instead of reviewing financial documents, she unlocked a secure company archive that contained historical records dating back several decades. She searched for her father's earliest business files, determined to understand how deeply Daniel's influence had shaped her family's history. Folder after folder revealed a remarkable pattern. Internal memorandums praised an unnamed architect who repeatedly declined consulting fees during the company's most difficult years. Handwritten notes described a young professional who insisted that protecting employees mattered more than maximizing profit. Old photographs showed Daniel standing beside construction workers rather than executives, smiling modestly while others accepted awards. Emily continued reading until evening, discovering letters from community leaders, teachers, and nonprofit organizations, all thanking Daniel for quiet acts of generosity that had never appeared in newspapers or public announcements. One letter came from the principal of Lily's elementary school, describing how Daniel anonymously funded school lunches for families experiencing financial hardship after learning several children were quietly skipping meals. Another thanked him for designing a community center free of charge after a neighborhood fundraising campaign fell short of its goal. None of the letters mentioned publicity because none had ever been intended for public attention. Emily leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by the realization that she had spent years admiring highly visible success while overlooking the extraordinary strength of invisible kindness. At that very moment Daniel was doing exactly what he had promised earlier. He stood outside Lily's school beneath the shade of an old maple tree, greeting parents and teachers with the same warm smile that greeted everyone regardless of profession or circumstance. Lily ran toward him carrying a colorful drawing from art class, proudly explaining every detail before they walked hand in hand toward the pickup truck. On the drive home she happily asked whether Miss Emily might still be there for dinner. Daniel smiled gently. "I certainly hope so," he answered. "She has become an important part of our home." Back at company headquarters, Emily quietly closed the final archive box and looked out across the city as the evening sun reflected against the glass buildings. For the first time in her life she understood that the richest legacy her father had left behind was not the corporation bearing the family name. It was the example of recognizing greatness hidden inside ordinary people. Without hesitation she canceled several social engagements and drove back toward the small neighborhood where Daniel and Lily were waiting. When she arrived, the front porch light was already glowing warmly against the approaching sunset. Lily rushed outside with joyful excitement, proudly holding up her drawing. "Look," she said with a bright smile. "I made us a family picture." Emily looked down at the simple crayon illustration showing 3 people standing together beneath a large blue sky. There were no business suits, office towers, or symbols of wealth. Only 3 smiling figures holding hands beside a small house with flowers blooming in the yard. Daniel quietly stepped onto the porch beside her. Neither of them spoke for several peaceful moments. Then Emily folded the drawing carefully against her heart, realizing that the little girl had captured a truth she herself had only begun to understand. Families are not built by contracts, obligations, or promises inherited from the past. They are built one quiet act of trust, one honest choice, and one generous heart at a time. The days that followed brought a quiet clarity Emily Brooks had never expected to find. The luxurious condominium overlooking the city where she had once spent most of her evenings now felt strangely empty whenever she returned to collect documents or prepare for board meetings. Her thoughts continually drifted back to the modest house where Daniel Carter and Lily filled ordinary moments with warmth that no amount of success had ever provided. Early one Monday morning she arrived at company headquarters determined to settle the growing uncertainty surrounding her personal life. Rumors about the arranged marriage had spread throughout the organization, and several investors were privately encouraging the board to distance the company from what they considered an unconventional situation. Emily entered the executive boardroom with calm confidence, carrying no prepared speech and no legal briefing. Victor Langford and several senior executives were already waiting. The chairman welcomed everyone before addressing the subject directly. "Emily," he said respectfully, "our shareholders deserve to know whether the reports are accurate. We also need to understand how your recent personal decisions may affect public confidence." The room became completely still. Emily slowly stood and looked around the long conference table. For years she had spoken there about quarterly growth, acquisitions, and strategic expansion. This morning her voice carried a different kind of conviction. "Everything you have heard is true," she said calmly. "I am living with Daniel Carter and his daughter, Lily." Quiet whispers moved briefly across the room before fading again. Victor leaned forward with practiced confidence. "Then surely this arrangement is temporary until the legal obligations between the families are resolved." Emily looked directly at him before answering. "It is no longer an arrangement." The room fell silent once again. "When I first arrived at Daniel's home," she continued, "I believed I was fulfilling an obligation created by decisions made years before either of us had a choice. I believed I understood success because I had spent my life building companies. I was wrong." She paused only briefly before continuing. "I have met countless brilliant executives, but I have never met anyone whose integrity remained so consistent when nobody was watching. Daniel never asked about my wealth, my position, or my influence. He simply welcomed me into his home, protected my dignity, and reminded me what character looks like when it is lived every single day." Several board members quietly lowered their eyes. Even those who had questioned her judgment recognized the sincerity in every word. Emily smiled gently before speaking again. "Some people believe leadership begins inside a boardroom. I have learned it often begins around a dinner table where promises are quietly kept long after the audience has disappeared." Victor attempted to respond but found no words that could challenge honesty without appearing small. The chairman slowly nodded. "Then your decision is final?" Emily answered without hesitation. "Completely final. I am choosing this family because it is my choice, not because it was ever expected of me." That evening she drove back to the small house outside Denver beneath a sky painted with the warm colors of sunset. Daniel was helping Lily plant new flowers beside the front walkway when her car pulled into the driveway. Lily immediately ran toward her with joyful excitement while Daniel simply smiled the same gentle smile that had greeted her on the very first night. Emily walked across the yard until she stood beside him. "I made my decision today," she said softly. Daniel looked at her with calm curiosity. "Was it a difficult one?" Emily shook her head with quiet certainty. "It only became difficult when I tried to ignore what my heart already knew." Daniel's smile widened almost imperceptibly as Lily reached for both of their hands. Beneath the fading evening light, surrounded by nothing more extraordinary than fresh soil, blooming flowers, and a child who believed kindness was the most natural language in the world, Emily realized she was no longer honoring an old family promise. She was creating a new future built entirely upon trust, respect, and a love that neither wealth nor obligation could ever have arranged. Several months passed, yet the quiet home outside Denver remained remarkably unchanged despite everything that had transformed within it. Daniel Carter still woke before sunrise each morning to prepare breakfast, pack Lily's school lunch, and water the small vegetable garden before the rest of the neighborhood stirred awake. Emily Brooks, once accustomed to measuring every day by meetings, financial reports, and international conference calls, now found herself looking forward to simple mornings around the kitchen table where laughter arrived naturally and silence never felt empty. Success had once demanded every hour she possessed. Now she understood that fulfillment often appeared in moments too ordinary for headlines. The corporation continued to thrive under her leadership, but her decisions gradually reflected the lessons she had learned inside Daniel's modest home. She introduced employee family support programs, expanded educational scholarships, and quietly established a foundation that assisted single parents rebuilding their lives after unexpected hardship. When reporters praised the company for its renewed focus on people rather than numbers, Emily simply smiled and redirected every compliment toward the employees themselves. She never explained that the true inspiration came from a quiet father who had transformed her understanding of leadership without ever intending to teach a lesson. Daniel remained exactly as he had always been. He continued designing community projects, volunteering at the local library, helping neighbors repair fences and porches, and attending every one of Lily's school activities with unwavering consistency. Whenever someone thanked him for his generosity, he answered with the same gentle humility. "Kindness becomes stronger when it continues traveling," he would say. Lily flourished in the warmth surrounding her. Her teachers noticed greater confidence, brighter smiles, and an extraordinary ability to include classmates who often felt alone. One afternoon her elementary school organized a family appreciation celebration where children were invited to speak about the people they admired most. Standing on the small auditorium stage, Lily looked toward Daniel and Emily sitting side by side in the audience. Holding a sheet of paper covered with carefully written sentences, she smiled before speaking into the microphone. "My daddy taught me that promises matter even when nobody is watching," she said proudly. "Miss Emily taught me that strong people can still have kind hearts. They both showed me that family is something you build every day." The auditorium grew completely silent before warm applause slowly filled the room. Emily felt tears gather in her eyes as Daniel quietly reached for her hand. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Everything that truly mattered had already been said by the smallest voice in the building. Later that evening the three of them returned home beneath a sky glowing with the colors of sunset. They sat together on the familiar front porch where their journey had quietly begun months earlier during a rainy evening that had seemed impossible to understand at the time. The garden was now full of blooming flowers Lily had helped plant, and the wooden porch carried the comforting signs of a life shared through countless ordinary days. Emily leaned gently against Daniel's shoulder as Lily rested beside them, watching fireflies appear across the backyard. The silence surrounding them no longer carried uncertainty. It carried belonging. Daniel looked across the peaceful yard before quietly saying, "Some promises are given to us by the past. The most meaningful ones are the promises we choose to keep together." Emily smiled and nodded. She finally understood that the greatest gift her father had ever left behind was not an inheritance, a successful company, or an arranged marriage. It was introducing her to a man whose quiet dignity proved that love could never be purchased, status could never replace character, and a true home was built one act of trust, one act of grace, and one ordinary day at a time. As the evening settled gently around the little house, the family remained together on the porch, grateful that what had begun as an unexpected obligation had quietly become the life each of them had been searching for all along.